this a little bit because we've only got a couple of attendees. So the workshop is an overview of ethics requirements for federal contracts to prime contractors, and it can apply to subcontractors also. So it's not for state, county, or local governments, although some of the ethics requirements are similar. So you should have received 3 handouts for the class. Mary and Jeanette, do you have those?
Yes.
Okay, so one is the EEO-1 form. The other is the FAR clause titled Contractor Code of Business Ethics and Conduct. And the other is a consolidated minimum wage table, which we'll use, we'll refer to those in the presentation.
Yeah, and I found both of them. I didn't realize there were attachments, but I see them now. Thank you.
Okay. So I retired, a little background on me. I retired in December 2018 with 29 years of as a federal contracting officer with the United States Navy, all 29 years with the Navy, predominantly in construction, architect engineering, and service contracts. I've been working with PTAC office ever since I retired, the day after I retired, sharing my experience, knowledge, and horror stories with the contractors. Now that I'm on the other side of the table with you, I can tell you things that I couldn't tell you when I was a contracting officer. Kathy, would you like to add anything at this time?
Nope, I think you're good. Since Mary May is a client, we don't need to give her the PTAC spiel. So it's all yours, Terry.
Okay. All right. So throughout the presentation, you'll see a capital G. And as I learned early in my career from my supervisors, capital G means federal contracts, and little g's are all other government contracts, such as state, county, city, and whatnot. So you'll see a capital G throughout my PowerPoint presentation. You can, especially now that there's so few people attending, we can stop and take questions throughout the presentation, or you can jot them down and ask me at the end of the class. So a question that I want to ask now will only be for Mary. And I know you're from Skagit County, so that answers one part of the 2-part question. What state are you in? You're in Washington. The other is, have you had, or do you now have, a federal contract as either a prime contractor or a subcontractor? Yes.
And I would have, oh.
Yes or no?
The answer is no.
Okay. So that will help me.
But let me put a caveat on there. I have worked on the government side. My husband and I both, our company is a joint company with the 2 of us. And we have worked on the government side from federal, state, and tribal levels through our careers. No county or city experience, but we do have the federal from being on the side of the, like, oh, we need something done kind of thing. So anyway, and he's a lawyer. So I guess those are sort of our what we bring to the table.
So you were in the capacity of an employee of a prime or a subcontractor?
No, I was in the capacity of being a government employee, not a contractor.
Okay.
So I worked for the federal government, I worked for the state government, and he's worked for tribal and state. So we're from that side of dealing with contracts.
Yeah, the government side. So
Yes.
Were you in the capacity of a procurement person and a contract specialist?
No, I didn't have that level of detail or experience.
Okay, very good. Okay, so a little background. The U.S. government procures in goods and services, as of last year, $584 billion of taxpayers' money. And you can go back, I've gone back to 2015, where the government spent $464 billion. So that's a $120 billion increase in, was that four or 5 years there? and the trend is spending more every year. The thing to keep in mind is the rules and the priorities of each administration that's in office at the time. The regulations keep moving, so compliance is difficult. You need to keep up with it. Why it matters. Government contracts, it needs to be very transparent because we're spending the taxpayers' money. And so there's can be lots of audits and investigations conducted on lots of contracts every year. Compliance failures can result in your company having to do rework, rejection of the goods or services that have been provided by your company. Your invoices can be delayed or even reduced. Can be increased inspections, can be negative publicity for your company. You can get a poor contractor performance evaluation, which leads to a loss of future work because performance evaluations can haunt you for 5 years. There's mandatory disclosure requirements, and that can result in investigations, and companies can be held civilly and criminally liable under the False Claims Act, which we will talk about later, and your company can be suspended or debarred, and that can be 3 years or 5 years, and then you cannot get awarded another contract during that time. It's also the last line there is very important that your subcontractors are subject to this also. So let's talk about the.
Harry, just a quick interjection.
Yes.
The debarment, we are now required for anyone applying for any of the CARES grants that the state or local jurisdiction is administering we have to check that they're not on the debar list because it would keep them from those federal grants.
Right. So not only contracts, it also includes grants. You don't want to get debarred.
A quick question on the subcontractors, which is the direction we're going to start with. If the primary gets in trouble, you don't automatically become part of that if you haven't done misactions, do you?
Misconduct, no, but the investigation will probably include you.
Correct. Yeah, I would understand that they would want to know. They'd want my paperwork
Input.
and all of that. So okay,
Right,
but it's not an automatic disbarment down the line into the
No,
subs. Okay.
no. Well, so another way to look at that, well, subcontractors could be debarred if the result of the investigation was finding fault with the subcontractor as well.
Correct.
as the prime. But typically, there's no previous contract between the government and the subcontractor.
Right.
The
Okay.
previous contract is with the government and the prime contractor. So if the prime contractor is doing a violation, False Claims Act or whatever, then they're going to be debarred, but they may take a subcontractor down with them.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, Contractor Code of Business Ethics and Conduct and Hotline posters. So I've identified the Federal Acquisition Regulation clause that pertains to this. The clause will only be in contracts if the value of the contract is $5 million or more, and that the duration of the performance is 120 days or more. So less than 120 days, the clause won't be in the contract. And if it's less than $5 million, the clause won't be in the contract. And so if you're a prime contractor or even a subcontractor and you're going to subcontract out further and the value of that subcontract exceeds the $5 million, 120 days, this clause, FAR 52.203-13, needs to be in the subcontract also. The subcontractor is held to the same requirements. The next clause, FAR 52-14, is the display of a hotline poster. and it's applicable if the value of the contract is greater than $5.5 million. There's exceptions below there that if it's a commercial buy, which it means that it comes under FAR Part 12, the solicitation and the subsequent award, then it's the hotline poster is not applicable. And if the contract is being performed entirely outside the United States, the hotline poster is not a requirement. And it doesn't apply to small businesses. So when you see $5.5 million, some of the NAICS codes, small business size standard, may be less than that to be a small business. But once you get awarded that contract in that NAICS code, you're now a large business. So the clause is going to be applicable to you for this, not this instant contract because you were awarded the contract as a small business. But now that you've got the award, you're a large business under that NAICS code. Okay, so if you can refer to one of the handouts, I provided you in full text there, the FAR clause 203-13. And you can see the second line on that page that this clause was recently updated this year, just a couple of months ago in June 2020. So that's something that you want to be aware of when you read your clauses. They can change periodically. So a contract that you got 2 years ago could have a variation of this clause, and a solicitation that came out this year may have the same clause, but it has a different date. That means there's something that has been changed in this clause. So you want to make sure that you're always cognizant of the entire clause and read through it, especially to find out what's changed. So you don't have any conflicts with that.
So quick question, if I have a contract from say 2 years ago, or whatever, and there's a certain code of conduct that I need to comply with, does that stay, is that grandfathered in even if there's a code change the next year?
Yes, because the current clause is not in your contract from
Okay.
3 years ago.
So
Only
mostly it's making an assumption. It's not making the assumption, like I had something 2 years ago, I know what's going on, instead being aware that there could be a change if I get a new contract.
You are only held to the clauses in your contract when it was awarded.
Perfect. Okay.
Sometimes, and for example, my last couple of years as a contracting officer, the current administration and Congress passed some new laws that resulted in new clauses. And when they were issued down through the Department of Defense, they said mandatory, modify your current contracts and include these. So I'd have to issue a solicitation to all of my contractors and ask for, if there's a cost impact, submit a proposal. If not, then I would have to issue a modification on every one of those clauses to incorporate the new clause that Congress had passed. For example, one of them was the Federal Minimum Wage Act, stating that you have to pay all of your employees on your contract no less than this certain dollar amount. So that was as a result of an executive order, and it was mandatory to put in all contracts immediately. So we had to go through it and change that. So getting back to your original question, all the clauses that were in your contract when it was awarded are the only ones that you need to abide by. Clauses get updated afterwards. You don't abide by them unless the federal agency updates or modifies your contract to include them. So the clause requires that you have a written code of business and ethics and conduct, and it must be completed within 30 days after award of the contract. Also, you have to conduct ethics awareness and compliance, have that program, and establish it within 90 days after contract award. So in reading the clause, you'll see that it doesn't prescribe the content or say how long it has to be, nor does it say that you have to submit a copy to the federal agency for which the contract was awarded. And it must include a mandatory disclosure clause. We'll get into more detail in the clause here shortly. Establish awareness. So contractors must establish an ongoing business ethics awareness and compliance program. So what the company has to do is assign that responsibility to a level high enough in the organization, but not the principals. And we'll get to that here shortly also. Has to have reasonable efforts to exclude potential non-compliant participants, periodic review of your business practices and procedures, internal reporting mechanisms, and provide for disciplinary action for any improper conduct or the failure to take responsible precautions to prevent improper conduct. So that's a biggie. What to include in your business code of ethics. What I've done here is highlighted key important words to be cognizant of. So there's two parts to this. The first one, the contractor's internal control system shall include A and B. Establish the standards and procedures to facilitate timely discovery and improper conduct. And B, to ensure corrective measures are promptly instituted and carried out. The second part of this is, at a minimum, the contractor's internal control system shall provide the following. A, assignment of responsibility at a sufficiently high level and adequate resources. So it means just saying that the vice president of the division is responsible for the code of ethics and you don't give them any resources, money or whatnot, that's not sufficient. You have to identify who it is that has the responsibility, and you need to provide adequate resources for him to implement the program throughout the company. B, responsible efforts not to include an individual as the principal. So I mentioned that earlier. You don't want to have the president or the CEO of the company to be the person in charge of the business code of ethics. There can be a conflict of interest there. C, provide reviews of the company's business practices, procedures, and policies, internal controls. You want to do that on a regular basis. So that's what we talked about in A. That person who is assigned to that needs to be up there high enough in the organization and have the authority and responsibility to conduct these periodic reviews. D, an internal reporting mechanism, such as a hotline. So any employee who wants to report anonymously, there's a hotline phone number typically. That's the avenue that most companies use, is a hotline. Even in the federal agencies, we have in our public bulletin boards a poster with who to call, email addresses or whatnot for the individual wanting to blow the whistle on something that's unethical. E, disciplinary action for the improper conduct or for the failing to take responsible steps to prevent or detect improper conduct. And another part of the control system is timely disclosure, and we'll get into this in the next slide. That has to be in writing to the government agency of a potential violation. Mandatory disclosure. Again, I've highlighted some key words here. There is to be a timely reporting in writing to the agency's Office of the Inspector General and a copy of what you've submitted to the IG to the contracting officer of the contract that's issued, the agency that issued the contract. And what's next here is whenever the contractor has credible evidence that a principal, an employee or agent or subcontractor has committed a violation of the federal criminal law. 3 bullets below. So timely disclosure of the to the agency's Inspector General of credible evidence, which can lead to possible suspension, debarment for failing to disclose the credible evidence, or fraud or government overpayment. And last, the contractors or the subcontractors must demonstrate full cooperation with the federal agency when they are going to conduct an audit or investigation or corrective actions. Any questions on that? All right, so having said that, here's a question for you. How many disclosures do you think there are each year? Multiple choice: none, a few, hundreds, thousands. Mary?
Are we talking across the whole federal government?
Yep, federal government.
Oh
Or
my word. Well, I would hope it would be pretty high, because you'd want to know that there's been oversight, but I'm gonna guess maybe hundreds.
Okay.
Yeah,
Jeanette, you want to?
I like to be a little optimistic and say hundreds.
Okay. Because
Terry, we
if we say thousands, then we're saying, oh, there's lots of conflicts and violations out there.
Yeah, that's a little scary.
It is.
Terry, and
Yes.
Natalie did have to step away for a phone call, and she is on the webinar now.
Oh, great.
So
Okay. Natalie, a couple quick questions for you. Where is your office located? In what state?
Hi, Terry. I'm actually a PTAC, and I just enjoy your programming. So I am outside of Washington. I'm actually in Mississippi. But
Mississippi. Okay.
you all
All
do
right.
a fabulous job. And when I saw that you were a retired contracting officer, I wanted to jump in.
And harass me?
Oh, no. Learn. Oh, no.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. So the answer is the government receives about 200 disclosures each year, and the preponderance of them are related to labor mischarging.
Interesting.
Isn't that interesting? Okay, now we're going to get into.
Hey, Terry.
Yes.
Where did you find that information? Where did you find that info?
Well, I had it in there from the last time I taught the class. I'm not sure. This comes under harassment. Okay. Employment laws and regulations. So we're going into another facet here in this class. And now we're talking about employment laws and regulations. So employment laws in the federal contract arena are entirely, for the most part, different than what you'll find in private industry. So there's requirements for affirmative action. There's reporting and data collection. A couple examples are the EEO-1 requirement and the VETS form. And that's one of the handouts that I provided. I gave you a sample form of a EEO, Equal Employment Opportunity reporting requirement. That's if you meet the threshold for having to submit it. It's a 2-page form that has to be submitted if your contract is over a certain dollar value. So there's restrictions on hiring previous government officials or even current government officials. Wage and hour laws. So these are unique benefits and reporting requirements. So what I've identified there, the first 3 are for the different types of contracts that you may have. So the first one used to be called the Service Contract Act labor law. It's now called the Service Contract Labor Standard Statute. So Congress about 2017 took it upon themselves to rename these labor acts. Instead of making them short and concise, they made them longer. So the next one is what used to be called the Davis-Bacon Act. That's for construction. It's now called the Construction Wage Rate Requirement Statute. And the third one, the Walsh-Healy Public Contracts Act, is for supply contracts. The first one was formerly the Service Contract Act would be for service contracts. So in there, the Department of Labor, especially for the services and construction, provides wage determinations of how much you must pay your employees at a minimum, plus how much that's on an hourly rate, and how much you must pay them in fringe benefits at a minimum. Now, there may be union agreements that require you to pay more. So whichever is the higher is what you have to pay. And then there's the federal contract minimum wage rule. I mentioned that before. In my last couple of years as a contracting officer, the executive order came down and we had to modify all of our contracts as it was immediately effective, not for the next solicitation, but for all contracts right now. So not only did we have to put in our solicitations that were on the street being advertised, it had to issue an amendment to the solicitation to include this new clause. We also had to incorporate it in every existing open contract. So does anybody know what the federal minimum wage rate is? Substantially different than the state's minimum wage rates.
I don't recall off the top, but I'm thinking in the $7
Yeah,
range, maybe
You're-
close to 8, but not quite.
you are correct. It is, I had it here. I believe it's $7.15.
Oh, I was gonna guess 7.35. So, wow.
Well, it's not at my fingertips right now, but it's in that area. So another handout that I gave you there is the consolidated minimum wage table. So this is very interesting. When I first came across this for the last class that I put together, there's 3 categories on here. The first column is states that have a minimum wage rate that is greater than the federal minimum wage rate. And there are 29 states of the 50 states whose hourly rate is higher than the federal. And the next column is a number of states where their rate is the same as the federal minimum wage. There it is, $7.25. So there are 16 states, including Puerto Rico and some outlying territories. And also of interest, in the last column there are 5 states that have no minimum wage rate. So
Gary,
they can.
I think we're not seeing the page that you're on.
It's a handout that I gave you. It's
Oh, it's a handout.
It's
Okay,
one
got
of the
it.
3.
So sorry.
So of interest there's 5 states that have no minimum wage rate: Alabama, Louisiana, Mississippi, South Carolina, and Tennessee. So if they have a federal contract, they have to pay their employees at least $7.25. It'd be interesting to see if there are employees in those states that are not under a federal contract, how much they're actually making, like $3.50 an hour. It's like slave labor. And the last bullet down there is the paid sick leave rule. And what do I have on that? So in September of 2015, there was an executive order that came out and said that all federal contractors are to provide for 7 days per year of paid sick leave for their employees. That would include subcontractors also. This year, Congress passed the Emergency Paid Sick Leave Act in March of 2020, which provided for 2 weeks of paid sick leave in conjunction with COVID-19. So interesting. So when you have a federal contract, whether you are a prime contractor or a subcontractor, you are to provide the benefit of 7 paid sick leave days to the employees. And now, as of this year, if an employee gets sick and has to take time off of work for COVID-19, they can get paid up to 2 weeks of being absent from work. Ethics and compliance considerations. So I've identified here a number of the requirements and the source for them, the federal acquisition regulation part. So for example, the first one is employment laws and regulations. That's in FAR Part 22. The display of the hotline posters that we talked about earlier, it's in FAR Part 52. So it's a clause. Anytime you see Part 52 of the Federal Acquisition Regulations are the clauses. There's 53 parts to the FAR. The restrictions on former government officials, it's in the FAR, but it's also, if you have a Department of the Defense contract, there's also a DFARS clause. The Buy American Act, trade agreements, Fly American Act, ocean transportation by U.S. flag vessels. I had to deal with this when I was working in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba for 4 years. Our contracts had that clause in it, FAR Part 47. So when contractors were bringing in materials to the base to perform construction or service contracts, they had to bring it in by barge or by ship, tie it up to a pier, unload it. They had to use U.S. flag carriers. That's what this clause is about. Ocean transportation by U.S. flag carriers. So I processed a lot of requests for exemption so that the contractors could bring in a foreign flag carrier. The problem is that as the decades have gone on, there are fewer and fewer U.S. flagged carriers. And so it's quite easy for me as a contracting officer back then to approve that, because all they had to do was show evidence that there are no other U.S. flag carriers that could bring in one particular case that I remember, is sand and gravel for the construction of roads on the base. So they brought in barges that were Jamaican flag barges. So that's what that clause is about. Small business rules, that is Code of Federal Regulations. Truthful cost and pricing data is in the Federal Acquisition Regulations, Part 15. Conflicts of interest is in FAR Part 9, and there's a clause in Part 52. False Claims Act is U.S. Code. Contractors' gratuities to government personnel, that's a Federal Acquisition Regulation Part 3. And combating and trafficking in persons, that was part of the 2013 National Defense Authorization Act. So when that clause came out, that's another example where Congress, it was part of the Authorization Act, and I, as a contracting officer in all the federal agencies, we were mandated to modify that requirement into our existing contracts. So not just future solicitations, but immediately in all of our current contracts. So that's quite an effort when Congress passes these laws. Quite often it creates a lot of work for the federal agencies. Any questions on those sources and topics? Okay, so the next few slides is learning through questions. So true or false, the truthful cost and pricing data. When negotiating with the government, contractors may be compelled to provide the government with access to all of the contractors' actual cost data and internal costs and pricing information. True or false? Anybody want to take a stab at that? The answer is true. So once you have a federal contract, whether you are a prime contractor or a subcontractor, the truthful cost and pricing data, you must provide it to the contracting officer. Your closely held pricing information. Next question. Contractor Code of Business Ethics and Conduct. I provided the source there. It's FAR Part 52, so that's a clause. Like I said, Part 52 of the Federal Acquisition Regulations are the clauses. So it's 203-13, and I provided a hard copy for you as a handout. So the question, for government contractors, which of the following statements are true? A, Contractor's Code of Conduct could be 2 pages long and still be compliant with government regulations. True or false? We talked about this earlier. So the clause itself does not mandate how long your code of conduct needs to be, nor its content. So the answer to this is Contractor's Code could be 2 pages long and still be compliant. That's true. Next question, subcontracts performed entirely outside the US are not required to post a hotline poster. Recall that subject earlier. That is one of the exemptions. So remember, another one is if you're a small business, you're exempt. If you perform entirely outside the United States, you're exempt. Question C, contractors are required to report criminal conduct to the government, disclose documents, and cooperate in ensuing investigations. That was true. We talked about that earlier. Last question, small businesses are not required to have business ethics awareness or compliance programs. So that was one of the exceptions. If you're a small business, you're not subject to having the Code of Ethics and Conduct plan. Last question. This is in regards to False Claims Act, which is also called the Lincoln Law, because this is when it became in effect. And the source is US Code. Which of the following statements are true? The government can seek actual damages, troubled plus interest. The answer is true. B, false claims allegations can lead to criminal charges as well as civil remedies. And that's true also. Contractors can be penalized an additional $20,000 for every invoice that they submit to the government. That's true. What I want to emphasize here is, for example, on a construction contract, you can submit a progress payment, a request for progress payment on a monthly basis. So if, say, you had a $2 million construction project and it's going to last 2 years, you're submitting an invoice each month for the work that you've done the previous month. And so after a couple of months, it's been found that you have submitted false invoices, certified them, but the information, the content was false. Not only will you not be paid for the value of that invoice, but for every one of those invoices, you could be assessed a penalty of $20,000. The False Claims Act was enacted in 1863 as a response to contractors taking advantage of the government during time of war, which was the Civil War. And that's true. That's why they call it the Lincoln Law. Relators can sue contractors under the False Claims Act on behalf of the government, even if the government asserts there has been no wrongdoing. And that's true. And so relators can get a fee if they're successful in a suit against a contractor for False Claims Act. The Justice Department recovered $3.7 billion in fiscal year 2017 from False Claims Act cases. That's $3.7 billion 3 years ago. So 3 years ago, Department of Justice recovered $3.7 billion as a result of violations of False Claims Act. So now we're going to get into suspensions and debarment. Woo, it's a biggie. In addition to punitive remedies that can be implemented for past actions, the U.S. government also has a system for determining present responsibility. So for violations, conflict with your contract, or violations of any of the acts or laws, the government can proceed with suspending and debarring you as a contractor, as a prime contractor or a subcontractor, or any principals within the company. So typically a contracting officer, before they make award, one of the steps that they have to do is a responsibility check. So we have to go in and check to see if a contractor is on the debarment list. So not only are we checking to see if the company is debarred, we also get the names of the principals of the company and check for each of them also to see if they are debarred. So an example of that is Mr. Joe worked for company A 3 years ago, left the company, is now working for company B. Well, company A was debarred and all of their principals. Now, this new company B issued a proposal for a solicitation to get a contract awarded to them. And the contracting officer goes into the list of suspended and debarred companies and sees that company B is not on the debarment list. But the next step is to check the principals. And so they type in the individuals' names for each of the principals of the company and find out that Mr. Joe was debarred 3 years ago when he worked for this other company. And as a result, because he's a principal on this company, the contract cannot be awarded to this company because that individual is now part of this company and he's on the debarment list for 5 years. So he's got another 2 years of debarment. So the third bullet there, what we were just talking about, while suspended or debarred, the entity may not bid on or be awarded any new contracts or subcontracts for more than $30,000. Any ongoing work can continue. New awards or modifications may be allowed if in the best interest of the government. And individuals may not serve as an agent or representative of a government contractor. So like I was saying, if they're a principal now of another company, they cannot serve as an agent for that contractor. Continuing on, some agencies are more active than others in suspending or debarring contractors. The Department of Defense is the most active, followed by GSA, HUD, Department of Homeland Security, and Environmental Protection Agency are very active also. Activities for all agencies are on the rise. Actions grew over 130% from 2009 to 2016, so a matter of 6 years. There was an increase of more suspended and debarred contractors. So suspension debarment official, that's the agency's suspension debarment official, will review past actions, current personnel, policies, and corrective actions to assess present responsibility. So as I was saying, in conjunction with the SDO, the contracting officer that's assigned to a solicitation, a procurement action, has to check not only if the company is debarred, but also current personnel within the company. So the
Terry,
SDO, yes.
I have a question. A private company, do they have access to a system to look up potential hirees to bring into the company that could have been disbarred?
That's a good question. Nobody's ever asked me that before. Can private companies check the federal list of suspended and debarred individuals?
Yeah, like how do they know they, it's not that they're not gonna probably ask, or
And
maybe
check Sam.
it's at
Yeah.
Sam? They can,
Yeah, yeah, when you go to check for exclusions in SAM,
okay, exclusions.
you check for the individual versus the entity.
Oh, I didn't know you
So,
can do that.
so a company in private industry, Jeanette, correct me if I'm wrong, is considering getting into government contracting. They
Uh-huh.
want to know if the employees that they are interviewing are on the federal suspended and debarment list.
Right, because they can come and say, hey, I have experience, I've done this in the past for another company. How do they know? And then,
And so
so-
Kathy, you're saying that private industry companies can go into SAM and type in a person's name and see if they're on the debarred list?
Yeah, anybody can go to sam.gov, click search, and then but you want to search for, I think it says exclusions. And then you can do multiple entries at once, and you can tell it whether you want to search for an individual or for an entity.
Cool. So after this class, I'm going to go in there and type in my name and see what pops up.
very cool.
Yeah,
Thank
I
you.
have to do it every year for the PTAC application.
Oh, do you? So you check on me every year?
Every year.
We'll have a private conversation after class. All right, let's see. Did we cover everything here? Okay, so on the last bullet there, the SDOs have substantial discretion. They can debar entities based on imputed conduct of related parties, extend to their affiliates, conduct can be unrelated to a government contract. So for example, and this has happened a few times in my past career, is as a result of a civil or criminal action in the courts, unrelated to the government contract, we learned that a particular company has been criminally charged for some unethical conduct. As a result, the federal government, an agency SDO, can proceed to put that company on the suspended and debarred list. So they didn't have a violation on our contract, but because of their actions in private industry, they can get put on the suspended and debarment list. So an SDO has that discretion to add that company to the suspended and debarred list. And allegations alone are generally sufficient. So as I was saying, you don't even have to be found guilty. If the allegations are of such severe and potentially consequences, an SDO can propose that that company or individual be added to this suspension debarment list. And typically, most of those companies and individuals are debarred or suspended for up to 5 years.
So quick question on that, if it's allegations alone, and I end up on that list because somebody accuses me of something or my company, what is can I go and appeal that? Is there a way for me to get off the list if it's what I consider a false allegation?
Yeah, so most likely you're going to be aware of an SDO proceeding with that action. You probably want to contact them and provide information to dissuade him for putting you on the debarment list. He may not have all the information. Next slide. More suspension and debarment. So exclusions are immediate. Once you're on that list, it starts today. And removal from the list can take months at a minimum. Getting off the list will generally involve meeting with and presenting your case to the SDO, as we just talked about, to demonstrate present responsibility. The process is expensive, and even once you're off the list, your reputation and other damages may linger for years. All right, we're almost at the end here. So a summary: compliance risk questions for contractors. These are things for you to consider in getting a government contract. Which laws apply to your contract? Where is the project located? We talked about earlier, is it outside the United States or in the United States? What is the dollar value? So recall there are dollar thresholds as to which clauses apply to you and which ones don't. Is the contracting entity the Department of Defense or another agency? One of the reasons that's on there is because the Department of Defense is the most active agency for debarring, suspending contractors when there's violations. Are you a large or small business? So if you're a small business, you're going to be exempt from a lot of things. Is your contract a firm fixed price or a cost type contract? So one of the things I can say there is if you are getting into a cost type contract, be aware that your contract is going to be audited at the end. On a firm fixed price contract, if the value is greater than $10 million, you're subject to an audit at the end of the contract also. What waivers or exemptions are available? What is the contract timeline? So recall earlier, if your contract exceeds 120 days or less, that's the threshold. It's the performance period is 120 days. So you want to be cognizant of what's the performance period on your contract and how you can mitigate the risk of non-compliance by you or a subcontractor or a supplier. So once you are the prime contractor, you're responsible for your subcontractors and your suppliers also. So those are some compliance risk questions for you to consider in pursuing a government contract. Any questions? Cook all kinds of notes and save your questions for the end. Let's hear them. All right. Conclusion. Yes.
No, I was gonna say I did take notes and nope, I asked my question.
Okay.
Thank you.
And this presentation, Kathy Kokos will send out to all of you after the class. So conclusion. Because of the public trust issues involving and dealing with the U.S. government in any capacity, contractors, subcontractors, and suppliers working with government contracts must be acutely aware of the many rules impacting compliance and ethical behavior. So remember, like the first slide is, depending on the administration that's in office, what's important can shift from each administration. And Congress passes rules and laws all the time. So it's a moving target, and keeping up with it is an effort. Many of these rules have no commercial equivalent or are significantly relaxed in the commercial industry. Under the current administration, we have some inconsistent trends, relaxed regulations in some areas, such as employment, and increased regulations in others, such as Buy American Act. So as we know, the current administration is very big on buying from American or buying American-made products and the effort of bringing companies back into the United States for manufacturing. So like I said, each administration has different focus. So generally, we have seen minimal action and virtually no new regulations. Nonetheless, contractors and subcontractors should pay careful attention to the existing rules and the changing regulatory landscape. As I've mentioned throughout here, the rules and laws and procedures continuously change. So we need to keep abreast of those, so we're not in conflict or violation of those. Any questions on any of those? So for assistance, see your local PTAC. And for us in the Olympic Peninsula, that's Kathy Kokas. And there's her phone number and her email address. I don't have anything else, so I'm opening it up to you. Any aspect.
Thank you, Terry. It was interesting to see your overview, especially my background is more from natural resource agencies, federal and state. And so it's always fascinating to me to hear from other folks, for yourself from the Navy. It's a whole world that I don't have much exposure to. So it's always interesting to hear from another avenue of the government. So thank you. This is good.
Yeah, so taking a tangent off of what you said there, every year there is a conference of private industry and government, and a recurring thing over the decades have been a recurring comment is they'll say, you the Army and you the Navy and you the Air Force all work, you're all federal agencies, you're all part of the Department of Defense, but how come each one of you do things differently? And that's been a common complaint. So the last year that I was a contracting officer in 2018, I surmised that one of the reasons why my agency, Naval Facilities Engineering Command, started deleting our clauses was because of that comment that kept coming up every year from private industry. You know, you're all in the federal aid, you all come under the federal acquisition regulations, and all of you military agencies within the Department of Defense, which is Air Force, Army, Navy, Marine Corps, and the defense agencies like Defense Logistics Agency, all come under the Defense FAR supplement. But you all do things differently. And that is a huge frustration in private industry trying to get government contracts. And once they get them, if they have one from the Army and they have one from the Air Force and they have one from the Navy, they all administer the contracts differently. So my agency was directed to eliminate our clauses. So the Navy clauses were being eliminated, and we were to go to a high level of the clauses in the Federal Acquisition Regulation. So consequently, our solicitations and our follow-on contracts no longer have our local agency clauses. They're all at the Federal Acquisition Regulation. So I think that was the fallout from those decades of conferences and complaints, if you want to call that, from private industry. So I think the government agency is trying to be more streamlined and standardized in their federal contracts. So we'll see. All right, any other comments? Okay, well, thank you for coming, and we'll have this presentation sent out to you.
I do have a question offline when you guys, for you and Kathy and Mary Jo.
Okay.
You guys.
All right, thanks all.
Thank you.